Welcome to day 2 of GAMAC 4, the global meeting of global action against mass atrocity crimes. My name is Claire Dool and I'm your Master of Ceremonies. And welcome, a really big welcome to all of you who are joining us from around the world. We're looking forward to hearing from you, so do make your comments in the chat and also ask questions in the Q&A. And of course, tweet using the hashtag Prevention Pays Off and the Twitter handle @GAMAC_org. While we're waiting for a few more participants to arrive, I'm going to share with you a bit of information about interpretation. If you were with us yesterday, you'll know that this event is in French and Spanish. So if you were with us yesterday, or if you weren't, here are just a few memorable quotes from the panels that we heard. And what did we hear? We heard during the one that I moderated on addressing hate speech in an era of intolerance, the Assistant Director General for Information and Communication at UNESCO, Taufik Jelassi, said, "We need to tackle the supply and demand side of information. Hate speech may start online, but the impact often happens offline." OSCE representative for media freedom, Teresa Ribeiro, picked up on that point, that there's nothing virtual about harassment. And she said women in journalism and politics were leaving their profession due to this harassment and, in fact, to protect themselves. Professor David Kaye from the University of California said that we needed greater public oversight into what social media companies are doing, and that these companies are starting to realize that it's bad for business if they leave hate speech on their platforms. During the discussion on hate speech as a precursor to genocide, Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire, who led the ill-fated UN peacekeeping force in Rwanda during the genocide, said, "We need a movement of youth, the core users of digital platforms, committed to reinforcing the strength of digital media and who can prevent the social media companies from going rogue." Susan Benesch, director of the Dangerous Speech Project, said deleting inflammatory content will never work. The key is educating users to resist it. So those were some of the highlights from yesterday. I hope that you were able to attend this morning's workshop. We started with one on women legislators against racism, hate speech, and discrimination. So let's see the Miro board with the key highlights. You can see them there, I hope. That it's very obvious what those key takeaways were. And we can see that UN report in 2019 that over half of women in politics in Ecuador have been victims of discrimination in their professional capacity, and that civilians need to know the laws protecting them, especially women, to bring cases to tribunals, and that targeting women is often a strategy to silence women political opponents. I'll let you take just a few moments to take in some of those takeaways from that workshop. We also had the workshop on atrocities and masculinities, which I listened in on very briefly and found very useful, about how the fact that militarized masculinities are misogynistic, and that there were these categories of different types of misogyny: the protector misogyny from extremist men, the misogyny against feminists and women against these intercelibate groups, and misogyny, as we heard from Teresa Ribeiro, the OSCE representative on freedom of media yesterday, against women who are active in public life, journalists and politicians. So I thought that was very interesting. Also, have a look at the Miro board here, and you can see some of the other points from that workshop. So there was a third workshop, which also has only just finished, and that was on mobilizing youth against discrimination, hate speech, and incitement. So let's see some of the key takeaways on the Miro board from that workshop. There we are, quite a lot that you can see is happening with some of those regional differences in Africa, and as you saw there in Pakistan. So thank you. I think the Miro boards are very, very useful as a tool, as a recap tool. So in a moment, we're going to be hearing from the chair of GAMAC, who's going to be moderating a panel discussion on addressing hate speech and preventing discrimination in the European context. But before we go to that panel, let's first hear from Akhila Radhakrishnan, the president of the Global Justice Center. And I'm hoping that we're going to have a video that's being played in of her. Please just wait and we'll see whether we're going to hear from her. Well, that's a shame. I hope that we'll be able to bring you that video later. So all there is from me to do is to wish you up. It's coming just as I speak.
Sorry. It's because if you don't share it that way.
Hello from New York City and welcome to GAMAC 4. My name is Akhila Radhakrishnan. I'm the president of the Global Justice Center, an international human rights organization dedicated to advancing gender equality through the rule of law. The focus of GAMAC 4 could not be more important. As we know, hate speech, incitement, and discrimination increase the risk of occurrence of atrocity crimes, and addressing them along with other important imperatives such as a culture of impunity and lack of accountability as root causes of violence is a global imperative. And like the crimes that can result from these acts, hate speech, incitement, and discrimination too have a strongly gendered element to them. And so, as you convene this week, I hope that all of you will keep in mind the importance of addressing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and ensure that diverse voices, including women, have a seat at the table in order to truly find solutions to the problems at hand. I wish you all a productive session.
Thank you very much, Akhila, and for those words about the importance of taking a gender perspective. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Silvia Fernandez de Gurende, the chair of GAMAC, to moderate the first panel session. Silvia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Claire, for your presentation. Thank you for giving these updates of the very interesting work that has been taking place so far. And dear participants, welcome to this panel, Addressing Hate Speech and Preventing Discrimination Begins at Home, Good Practices from National Mechanisms in the European Context. This panel is the first one addressing hate speech and preventing discrimination, more specifically in the European context. And this panel will showcase conceptual approaches, normative frameworks, and good practices. I would like to warmly welcome our distinguished panelists. Let me introduce them to you. The panel will start with Ms. Martin Brunschwig-Graf, President of the Swiss National Commission Against Racism. Martin has accompanied GAMAC's community last year in the series of events leading to this GAMAC 4. After her, we will then focus on the experience from Denmark with Ms. Nana Krusa, Senior Advisor and Team Leader for Ethnicity, Equal Treatment at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Nana has also accompanied us last year in the series of events leading to GAMAC 4. Then moving on to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's High Commissioner on National Minorities with Dr. Elżbieta Kuzborska-Pasha. She is the Senior Legal Advisor at the Office of the High Commissioner on National Minorities. So I am very pleased to be with our distinguished panelists, and I will start with Martin, dealing with hate speech and racial discrimination online and in social networks, as well as prevention of racial discrimination in schools and for young people, are two main areas of the Swiss Federal Commission Against Racism for 2020-2023. So, Martin, can you provide us examples of prevention and awareness raising campaigns carried out by the National Commission in these main areas? Can you share good practices from your analysis, research, and monitoring, as well as way forwards that could be applied to other countries?
Thank you, Sylvia. I am very glad to be with you today. I will preface something. Switzerland, as you know, is a federalist country, and that means that we have no big campaign during the 7 years until yet from the Commission as itself. But we can observe a lot of activity in the field of prevention of racism and the fight against hate speech on the field. And I would say the actors, for instance, as educational institutions, schools, for instance, integrations delegates who are also in charge of the fight against racism, private organizations and institutions, and especially women and youth organizations. So we are not the direct initiator of centralized approaches, but with an exception I will give as an example later. It can be noticed the first thing that means that a number of approaches that focus on youth when it comes to prevention. The first example is the platform Education 21st or 21, which serves as a link between schools in Switzerland in terms of educational material and projects in school against racism and hate speech. Secondly, the Service Against Racism, which is an administration office at the federal level, supports financially such projects in schools. We have examples if you need on the website. The advantage of such approaches is flexibility and responsiveness. It's very important. And the difficulty is to ensure continuity. I have to mention that because when we are working with schools, the problem is that when we are at the ground level, it could be different, or it could be that the teacher can stop the activities or such. It depends. But the fight against hate speech is not only about racism when it comes to dealing with the issue in schools. I have to precise that too. The actions that are carried out are often related to the use of social networks, their dangers, and harassment. This is why good practices are indeed very different from each other and sometimes return to global strategies, sometimes to more targeted strategies. The fight against hate speech raises specific questions that make action more complex. Should we respond to hate speech? Do we encourage hate speech by countering it? What is the risk of intervening in turn on social networks? Experts do not always agree on how to proceed, and the answer may also differ depending on the situation. I want to give one example of non-racist specific initiative called Stop Hate Speech, launched early this year. There are volunteers can act against hateful comments on social networks. An algorithm has been created to recognize these kinds of publication by members of the community around this new platform, launched by Alliance F, an umbrella organization of women's organizations who are more often exposed, as you know, to hate speech. There is a search engine to be enriched and advice on how to react, a tool to determine if it is hate speech, but it is difficult to say yet how effective it is because it's a project to be followed to learn from it in the future. So I have to mention that fight against online and social media hate speech is only beginning in Switzerland too. The Federal Commission, that's a project we have yet, is launching a special web link on November 22, this November 22, to give everyone the opportunity to report an item or event concerning hate speech found online or on various social networks. Why this approach? To be able to prevent, we need to be able to monitor hate speech on the internet. Some associations already do this, especially in the field of anti-Semitism, but it has become necessary to proceed in a more organized way. The idea is to create a database, but it is also to offer the possibility to those who report an episode concerning hate speech of racist nature to be able to benefit, if they wish it, of advice and appreciation on behalf of the Commission. This can range from how to report the event to the media concerned to a more legal approach when it warrants about report to the courts. In the latter case, the Commission will not intervene directly, but can advise the person. This operation, which begins on November 22, also had another aspect of good practice. A private school in Geneva, active in communication and marketing training, which had noticed manifestation of hate speech in its establishment, decided to fight on several fronts, notably through internal awareness operation. For instance, a webinar, and we were present as a commission at this event, but also above all it decided to entrust the students of the school with a mandate for a concept for the dissemination of the new hate speech reporting link launched by the Commission on November 22. It will be the students of this school who will propose a communication concept that will be implemented on behalf of the Commission. This will give them the opportunity to experience the fight against hate speech in a practical and professional way. Finally, as I said at the beginning, Switzerland is a federalist country. This is why the Commission has invited the cantonal official responsible for the fight against racism to an exchange and discussion session in December 1st. We have to exchange concrete prevention approaches and strategies related to the topic, exchange possible solutions and measures to reinforce the fight against hate speech and present existing services and benefits. As you can see, we are at the beginning and not at the end, but we will have to communicate a lot in the future on this subject. If I had to summarize this brief presentation, I would say that the rule in terms of prevention is to involve the actors on the ground in the process, to encourage creativity and the exchange of good practices, and to admit that there is no miracle solution. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very, very much, Martin, for your remarks, and also for highlighting the particular challenge to respond to hate speech when you are in a federal country. So you have to you have to go in a different way. You cannot directly impose measure in the country as such. So this is, I think, is extremely important for many federal countries like myself, and also your emphasis on the need to remain flexible and also to be aware that there is no one solution fixes all, because also Sometimes, indeed, you said something that maybe other speakers can also mention also, that of course we need to understand, identify and monitor, but sometimes what is the appropriate response is not so obvious. So thank you, Martin, for your remarks. And may I like to remind participants that to send their questions via the chat feature, please, so we can ask our participants your questions when they finish their own interventions. So Nana, now I would like now to turn to you. We know that the prevention of hate crimes in Denmark has been one of the main focuses of the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Can you share current prevention initiatives such as training, for instance, for the police and government officials, as well as awareness raising campaigns on hate speech?
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation. I am very, very honored to be here to talk to you on such an important and unfortunately very relevant topic as hate crime is. In Denmark, as in many other countries, we have problems with hate crimes. One problem is that only few report that they have experienced hate crime. So underreporting is a huge problem. A second problem is it's very difficult to get a conviction in a hate crime case. But today I will not talk to you as so much about the problems, but more about the preventive initiatives that I hope can be of interest to you. The first initiative I will touch upon concerns stronger and more effective legislation. Because if you have a strong and effective legislation, you will be able to use that as a preventive mechanism. And we have just made the Danish legislation to combat hate crimes stronger, actually very recently, like last week. And let me explain how. It might be a little technical, but bear with me. It follows from the explanatory notes to the Danish Criminal Code that it constitutes an aggravating circumstance when a crime is either wholly or partly motivated by hatred towards, for instance, the victim's race or religion. However, numbers show that the system tends to treat crimes as hate crimes only when they are wholly motivated by hatred, thus overlooking cases where hatred is only part of the motive. And that is what we hear from many people who've experienced hate crime, that there was maybe also some other things going on and other conflict, but hate towards the victim and the victim's affiliation with, for instance, a religious group is also part of the motive. So recently, a citizens' initiative demanding a change in legislation to ensure that also hate crimes where hatred is part of the motive are convicted gained more than 50,000 votes. So last week, a majority of the parliament voted for a change in the Danish Criminal Code, underlining that also crimes that are partly motivated by hatred are considered a hate crime. This might not sound as a big deal, but it is. And we are expecting to see more cases regarding hate crimes come through the system in the future. And we should not underestimate that this also sends a message to the public, including the groups that are at risk of experiencing a hate crime, and that might not report a hate crime. So it sends the message that the system, both the political and the justice systems, are taking this area very seriously. So it's a recognition of the seriousness of the hate crime area. The second initiative I will touch upon is also about legislation and concerns having as many vulnerable groups covered by the legislation. And just recently, the Danish Parliament have amended the legislation so it also covers persons with disabilities. So this is a recognition of the fact that persons with disabilities also experience hate crimes. The third initiative I will touch upon concerns continuing professional development of the police. The police is a key actor when we talk about hate crimes. The hate crime area is part of the police training, the police education. However, it is also possible for a policeman or a policewoman after he or she has been in the field for a number of years to take a one-day course on hate crimes that will give an insight into the complexity of the hate crime area. This course will actually now be extended. It sounds maybe a little silly, but it's actually rather important, to a 2-day course in the future, because they will have more room for input from civil society organizations. So they will be able to have more dialogue with people who've actually experienced hate crimes on their own body. So this is actually extremely important that they have that dialogue with people who've experienced hate crimes, so the police understand what it actually means and how they should interact with potential victims of hate crimes. So this is actually a step in the right direction in combating hate crimes. The fourth initiative I will touch upon is dialogue with the police. For instance, we've just had the World Pride in Copenhagen here in August, and as a preparation for that big event, the police had meetings with different NGOs in order to address how they could provide the best protection during the Pride. So the fact that the police actually contacts civil society organization, NGOs, saying, how can we make sure that we help by preventing hate crimes to occur during the World Pride? So they actually, in cooperation, could actually plan how they could address hate crimes during the Pride. And the fifth and final initiative is not so much about prevention as how to recuperate if you've experienced a hate crime. It is a project called Rooted, which is a therapeutic course for adults with an ethnic minority background who felt the consequences of hate crimes and racism. And I'm mentioning this here because even though I hope that the other initiatives I have mentioned will go a long way to ensure better protection, there will unfortunately still be people who've experienced hate crimes, and maybe and hopefully Rooted will be able to help them. So this was just very, very briefly a couple of initiatives, preventive initiatives that I've been able to talk about from Denmark. Unfortunately, we do not do very much campaigning, but maybe that will come in the future. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Nana, and thank you for speaking about these initiatives to combat hate crime, which is of course not the same as hate speech. Is going beyond the hate speech to go already into the crime sphere. But so it was very interesting for us to understand also how you're trying to cover more acts by changing the legislation to encapsulate not only acts that are wholly motivated by hatred, but also partly motivated by hatred. And thank you very much for focusing on these ideas of training of the relevant actors, including, of course, the police, and even short trainings, and also the importance of dialogue. And yes, indeed, the importance of campaigning, which you said, unfortunately, you don't do yet. So thank you for these very important remarks. And now we move to Elzbieta. Elzbieta, the Office of the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities focuses in identifying and addressing causes of ethnic tensions and conflict. So can you share recent thematic recommendations and guidelines to counter hate speech and disinformation in these areas?
Sure. Thank you so much, Sylvia, dear experts, participants. Big thank you to the GAMAC team for its global efforts in building more resilient, tolerant, and peaceful societies, and for inviting me to contribute to today's meeting. Also, perfect timing of this event, as today we also celebrate International Day for Tolerance. So today I would like to share my experience and the experience of the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities in addressing hate speech and preventing discrimination, because from our experience, no society is immune from hate speech and discrimination. I would like to paraphrase a bit the theme of this session, addressing hate speech and preventing discrimination begins at home. I would say that it starts at the highest political level, with the understanding among the political elites that the effective policy approaches to address hate speech and prevent discrimination are crucial and contribute to more peaceful and safe societies. So in brief, what we need along with effective policy approaches at the highest level is practical, concrete actions to address racism within local communities, countries, regions, and international institutions. Because available data reveals that 3/4 of hate speech targets are minorities. There's also an important gender dimension here that is perhaps not always fully appreciated. And I would like to highlight it today. Women in general and women who belong to minorities can easily become the targets of not only discrimination and hate speech, but also other forms of abuse, sexual violence, and human trafficking. So from HCNM's perspective, hate speech, racism, xenophobia, and other forms of discrimination are clear warning signs that we need to do much better in supporting integration processes in our societies. Is there one effective policy approach to address hate speech, racism, discrimination, and xenophobia? The brief answer is no, because the effective policy approach to address racism, hate speech, and discrimination should be tailor-made and depend on specific circumstances of the given society. While there's no one policy approach, there are some policy elements that contribute to more tolerant and peaceful societies. That's to the extent possible preventing the instances of discrimination and racism. And here I would like to bring your attention to the existing 9 sets of the HCNM's recommendations and guidelines. They draw their authority from the experience of over 25 years of the office and subsequent high commissioners in implementing conflict prevention mandate. And from that experience, we can single out specific elements that could help addressing hate speech, racism, and discrimination. And after my presentation, I will share in our chat a link to those recommendations. In brief, the HCNM Ljubljana guidelines, for example, on integration of diverse societies, also the Hague recommendations regarding educational rights of national minorities, Oslo recommendations regarding the linguistic rights of national minorities, the Lund recommendations on the effective participation of national minorities in public life. Those documents were primarily aimed at elaborating and enhancing minority rights in the areas of education, language, participation in public life and socioeconomic life, and to increase tolerance in our societies, thus contributing to more peaceful and cohesive environment. So they cover structural principles without which good integration and non-discrimination policies are difficult to conceive as feasible. Another point, we have a clear responsibility to address intolerance, including hate speech, including in social media. And in February 2019, HCNM published the Tallinn Guidelines on National Minorities and the Media in the Digital Age. And this document also provides states with practical advice on how the media, and in particular digital media, can be harnessed as a powerful tool for preventing conflict and building integrated, resilient society. When it comes to actors of those processes, in brief, to combat intolerance and hate speech, we need to take a holistic approach, an approach that involves authorities, civil society, grassroots communities, and academia. This will need to entail raising awareness, educating the general population, and legislating against offenders. In the long-term approach and integration and non-discrimination, national policies on a national level would be of an utmost importance. And to illustrate this approach, I would like to present a good practice from Canada that could inspire our European policies and environment. There was a strong response from the government of Canada to anti-Asian racism and hate speech that erupted together with the ongoing pandemic. On the occasion of the Asia Heritage Month this May, the government has published information on how we can fight anti-Asian racism. The government published a list of recommendations which included learn about Pan-Asian diversity and the unique identities, challenge stereotypes, show solidarity with Asian communities in Canada, be an ally, call out acts of racism, discrimination, microaggression, interrupt unconscious biases. So from this perspective, the most important thing that happened here is the public rhetoric where government realizes and recognizes the problem. And I believe it's an important gesture of solidarity because the message was clear. Anti-Asian racism and discrimination is a federal matter and should be addressed. More importantly, this approach from the government was beautifully complemented with some important grassroots initiatives. It was really heartwarming to learn about the fact that some communities undertook timely initiatives, first of all, to raise awareness, secondly, to confront, and thirdly, to push for action in addressing issues of discrimination of Asian communities and people of Asian descent. So I would like to give an example of the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario and Toronto District Board School, who collaborated with a team of educators of Asian descent and developed a teaching material entitled Addressing Anti-Asian Racism, a resource for educators, which was released a few months ago. And this document supports teachers, school leaders in deepening their knowledge, in redesigning curriculum, in shifting classroom conditions and creating school spaces to address anti-Asian racism during COVID-19 and beyond. So I think this initiative is amazing and inspiring as it starts at the federal level and continues with school communities on this crucial and the most basic level of education. So in conclusion, racism, discrimination, hate speech in all forms are unacceptable and have no place in the OC area and beyond. It runs counter the values and spirit of the diverse and inclusive society that we strive to build. And it is our collective responsibility to step up, be allies, and stand together against xenophobia, hate fueled by misinformation and all forms of racism, including anti-minority races. And to tackle those problems effectively, we need, first of all, an understanding on the highest political levels, because no society is immune from hate speech and discrimination. Secondly, effective policy approaches, including legislation, national plans to combat those instances. And then involvement of multiple actors of society on grassroots initiative and all of us. So that was my messages, and thank you so much for your attention. Now I will share HCNM's recommendations in our chat.
Thank you very much for this important reminder that in order to combat hate speech, we need to understand and prevent the underlying causes of discrimination, racism, xenophobia. And you said something very important, and there are some questions that are coming from the audience. That of course, minorities are targeted by hate speech, they're vulnerable groups, and then you stress the gender dimension of these targeted attacks. And there is a question actually that is related to this, but it's a question for Nana, because they say that your 2017 report on hate speech in the public online debate highlighted that male contributors are responsible for by far the majority of the hateful comments made. They say 76%. And such comments typically targeted a group rather than a specific individual. And hate speech based on gender is more often targeted at women than men. Has this trend changed since 2017 and since then? And is it something that your institute is doing in this regard?
Thank you so much for the question. Unfortunately, I don't think that the situation has changed. We don't have any new numbers, but what we can actually see is, for instance, today is election day here in Denmark for the municipalities. So we're actually looking into, oh, I have a very bad line. Can you hear me? See me? Okay. Thank you. But yeah, it's election day here in Denmark today. So I'm worried if I might not go through. Okay, I'll try and keep talking and then we'll see. But it's election day today for the municipalities, and we're actually looking into the hatred, especially towards women, that they've experienced online up till this election. So in a couple of weeks, or maybe in the beginning of next year, we'll actually have a new report looking into hate speech against especially women politicians. So I think that will be the answer from now. Sylvia, can you hear me?
I'm afraid I'm losing connection here. I'm afraid we will need to suspend for a few seconds because we are having some technical difficulties from here. I will be with you in a minute, Nana. Sorry for this.
No, perfect. Thanks.
Hello, I'm sorry that we've been having these technical issues and we're trying to fix the problem. So this is Claire, the Master of Ceremonies. Martine, Nana and Elisbieta, I've been listening to your remarks and there are some questions that are in the chat. So if you are there, and at the moment I can't see you, I can just see the screen that says sorry for the inconvenience. I could ask you some of the questions. So if I was able to see our participants, thank you, everybody. I'm not Sylvia, I'm not a judge, and I'm not the chair of GAMAC, but as soon as Sylvia sorts out the technical problems, I'm sure she'll be back. So there is a question here, Martine, in the chat. You might have seen it. Which says the Federal Commission provides consulting and expertise services. Yesterday, during one of the panels, we saw the need for social media firms to change their business model. Indeed, I remember asking a lot of the speakers yesterday about that in the panel I was moderating, to change their business model to better tackle hate speech. Could you share examples of your services and if these are targeted to social media firms? So yes, that would be really interesting to know what the Swiss Confederation, and we know that it's difficult because I'm here in Geneva and it's a federation and it's the cantons who make the decision, but what you're doing about this issue of hate speech online.
If I right understand your question, it's about how the social media are regulating their own website and so. And in Switzerland, we have not specific law about that. That means the difficulty for social media to, how do you say that, to follow and to have some legal action against for the social media is the first question. Where happens the story? And it could be very difficult legally because if you have a social media saying our site is not in Switzerland, it's somewhere in Europe or somewhere in US, it could be very difficult to have a good action. So we are trying to speak about signalizing to the social media what could happen, and that could decide themselves what they do. It's not enough. What we think is not enough because they have to be more proactive about assertions and action when they are against the law, for instance, a criminal law. And it's really an issue, but we are here all at the beginning of the issue because it could be difficult. But the first step I said before is monitoring is the first step and give good examples. If you have no example, it's difficult after to go and to speak with the social media. We had a discussion for 2 or 3 years before, and we have to follow perhaps in the future.
Thank you very much for that. Nana, not wanting to put you on the spot, but I remember yesterday on social media talking about this European Digital Services Act, where one of the issues is trying to get the social media companies to be more transparent. Can you speak from a Danish perspective on what's being done to try and limit hate speech online?
Yes, I can say a little bit about it, but I think it very much goes to, and this doesn't fix all of it, but to moderate, that they have to be better at moderating what goes on online. So instead of, hatred, how do you say that, makes more hatred. So if when you see like the threats going down and you see like one hateful remark and another one, so we want them actually to be much better at moderating it very, very fast, in order for it to actually to stop and saying, okay, we do not want platforms where we have hate speech. If it was out on the street, we would say stop. We would say, well, this is probably illegal. We can actually file a report to the police. But when it's online, it has this very different format. But we want them to be much better at moderating. So that I think that is very important to say. Okay, we have to very fast remove all these hateful comments.
Mm.
And especially,
Sorry, please
No.
carry on.
No, I was just going to say, especially these days, as I said before, we have election today for the municipalities, and we see that a lot of the female candidates actually experience a lot of hate online, and it makes them want to, draw back from democratic participation. So it's a democratic problem. So it's very, very important that we actually do moderate the online debate, as we would do if it was a real life debate.
Absolutely. Nana, just to follow up on something that you said, and I noted down, I thought your Rooted project was really interested, and I can see that somebody in the chat wanted to know more about that. And I'm just wondering, what were the success rates? This was aimed at ethnic minorities who felt that they'd been abused online. How do you help people recover? I don't know whether you can put any more pressure on that particular bone.
I can, and then I have to confess that it is not our project, but it's someone that we've been in dialogue with, because they know that we at the Danish Institute for Human Rights actually do get inquiries, etc., about hate crimes from people who've actually experienced hate crime. And sometimes we say, well, you can actually file a report to the police, but we also know that that's usually not the best solution. So we heard about this program that is called Rooted, that is actually helping people with racism and traumas. So it's more therapeutic. It's brand new. It just started up this year, but I think it's a very good alternative to actually also saying, okay, this might actually help one person to move on, but also actually maybe to actually file a report to the police. I had just a very concrete experience. A woman who'd experienced a rather, I would say, awful hate crime. And she was so affected by it that she could only talk to me through her psychologist. So she couldn't even herself talk to a stranger on the phone, me, about this experience. So it's very, very difficult to help these people who've experienced hate crime. And if they also experience that the justice system, the legal system doesn't recognize the experience, then it's extremely difficult to move on with your life. So I think this Rooted, and I don't think it's got public funding. It's a civil organization that are funding it. But I think it's a very, very good and interesting step in another direction in order to combat hate crime and to actually help the victims.
Well, I'm delighted to say that Sylvia has resolved her technical problems. Sylvia, just to say that there's a question from Georgi Tata in the chat that you might want to pick up on. So I will leave you in the capable hands of Sylvia as she concludes this session. And if you're able to unmute yourself.
Sorry, that was me, and that was not a technical issue. Sorry for that, and thank you, Claire, for stepping in and for solving this technical problem. Thank you very much. I have no more questions on my side from the chat. I don't know if there is one pending that you still have, Claire. If you have it, please ask it yourself, because I don't have it myself.
Okay, so there's one that's appeared in the chat, which says, it's relatively easy to make progress in countering hate speech and related challenges where governments have the political will to support such activities. However, the real challenge and key of progress is how to get those states and governments who oppose such activities to change their approach. Recommendations are nice, but they have no power. That's an issue we need to set out on our agenda, the sooner the better. What's the view of the panelists? So it's okay when you've got democratic governments with political will. I'm summarizing here. What about those who don't have any political will to counter hate speech and these challenges? I hand over to Sylvia to direct the traffic there. And you've just got 5 minutes left.
Thank you very much. And I think this is a wonderful question for the three panelists in terms of what would you say to this? But actually, some of you have already indicated that there are many actors that are relevant for implementing the right recommendations. But maybe you could have 1 minute each to tell us what to do to really provide an incentive for this political will that sometimes is lacking. And actually, that would also be a good recommendation if you have any views on this for GAMAC to act, because GAMAC is indeed tries to foster this political will to prevent. So any views on this very, very good and relevant question?
Yeah, can we answer?
Who wants to start? Yes, yes, please, go ahead.
Because I am an old politician, that's the reason, because I can try to give an answer. But I think it's very important to see, you can have parliament, could be useful in some action, but at the end of the day, it's a civil society. And if we cannot work with the government, if we cannot work with the parliament, we have to work with the civil society, with the people, really with the people on the ground. And that's a reason, because I explained at the beginning, it's so important to have the point of view and the action of different associations, institutions, human rights people and others, and that can be very helpful. And suppression is the only way of action if you have government who don't hear the things. But it's a long way. I have to say, I am the president of the Prevention Against Torture too, and we see that exactly the same way. When you have not the government, we try to have the civil society, and we work with them.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Martina. Nana, or?
Yes, what's difficult? Yes. I can just take it for a minute, but what a very difficult question to end the session with. But as Martine said, there are many different actors involved in combating hate crimes. And even though today I've talked about the preventive initiatives we have here in Denmark, we have many problems as well. So it's not all that. Even though we have a democratic government, etc., there are many things we can't get them to do. But I think it's extremely important. It sounds a little cliche, but to keep focused, to keep pushing, and civil society plays a vital role. And also, if possible, to actually use strategic litigation. Take as many cases as you can, if possible, to the court system, etc. So you have to push on so many different levels for a change, and if possible, show the politicians what they are missing, like what can they gain from actually combating hate crimes. More stable country means stable finances, etc. But you're in it for the long haul, and it's extremely important to just keep fighting. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this, Elzbieta.
Thank you so much. On prevention, to complement what was just said, as a strategy, I would propose to tackle this problem from a different angle, and maybe to encourage, to assist this particular government on the level of education. So education from our HCNM's perspective is the most powerful instrument in promoting positive narratives and countering those stereotypes that, lead to hate speech, hate crimes. So from teaching about young people about cultural diversity, societal pluralism, problem of the hate speech, its consequences, gender biases, to foster tolerance and non-discrimination. So it's also central in wider integration and non-discrimination policies and processes, this education angle. That's why the youth is at the forefront of our long-term conflict prevention efforts. In our office, we often emphasize the importance and value of including teaching about human rights, minority rights, and tolerance, and promoting this diversity and pluralism in schools' curriculums. We also encourage teaching about histories and cultures of the minorities that reside in particular countries. It also contributes to strengthening understanding and tolerance and mutual acceptance. So maybe if we cannot in this particular political environment tackle problem of hate speech, hate crimes directly, maybe we could try through initiatives, through assisting political elites, the government, to tackle it through this different angle of education, building more inclusive, more tolerant societies. That would be something that I would suggest to complement, of course, that was just said by other experts.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these very important final remarks that go very well with the theme of our panel. We started by saying, and this is the title of the panel, no society is immune, and you have all confirmed this and underlined this. No society is immune, but also all society and all sectors of society need to be pushed along, or I would say attracted to these prevention efforts. And of course, governments play a key role, and you mentioned this, you talk about political elites, but we need to push them and we need to assist them. You mentioned the importance of education and training, and of course, education of the youth. And that brings back something that was also said yesterday, the importance of educating the youth to counter hate narratives, to make, in the long run, a more resilient society. So I think this was extremely important. And actually, as you said, it's not just governments of democratic governments having more or less political will, but actually all political elites need to be pushed or assisted. And the entire society is responsible or needs to be attracted to this endeavor. So thank you very much. I'm sorry again for these technical glitches, but it was a wonderful panel. And I hope that participants have taken away many of these important comments that you made. So thank you very much. We will now break for 15 minutes until we go into our next panel. Thank you.
Can I ask all panelists, please, to keep their video on? It will not be seen on the screen. We will control which person is shown on camera, but just so that we don't forget in the middle of the panel. Thank you.
Welcome back from the break. And just to let you know that this discussion is in English, but it's interpreted in French and Spanish. I can see that many of you are tweeting, so please do carry on using the Twitter handle @GAMAC_org, and of course the hashtag prevention pays off. So before the break, we were looking at addressing hate speech and preventing discrimination in the European context. We're now going to look at the same subject in the international context, and it's my pleasure to hand over to the moderator for that discussion, the chair of GAMAC, Silvia Fernandez de Guerendi. Silvia, the floor is yours. And please unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you, Claire, and welcome to all participants to this second panel. As indicated already by Claire, we have had a first panel on exactly the same theme, a theme on the European context, and now we will look at the same theme, addressing hate speech and preventing discrimination begins at home, good practice from national mechanisms worldwide. And here we will focus in particular on the Americas, Africa, and the Asia Pacific. This panel, like the previous one, will showcase conceptual approaches, normative frameworks, and good practices in these regions. Now, I would like to extend my warm welcome to our very distinguished panelists, whom I'm pleased to introduce. We will start with Mr. George Amo. I'm sorry if I'm not going to be pronouncing your names very correctly, but he's the Executive Secretary of the Ghana Peace Council, who will speak on behalf of the chairman, Reverend Dr. Ernest Adu Nyafi, who could not join us today. I would like to thank everybody at the Ghana Peace Council for its long-time support to GAMAC. Then we will go into my own region with my old friend and strong supporter of human rights protection and promotion, Eduardo Bertoni. Eduardo is the representative and coordinator of the Instituto Interamericano de Derechos Humanos, the Inter-American Human Rights Institute. And last but not least, we will hear from Professor Vitit Muntar-Bornhorn. Vitit is Professor Emeritus of Law at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, Thailand, and among other mandates is the former Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Cambodia. So let me thank you, Vitit, as we are all very pleased to have an expert such as you, who has served several UN Human Rights Council special procedures. We are very pleased to have you here in this panel. So well, we start with George. George, violence before, during, and after elections have threatened some African countries. The Ghana Peace Council mobilized and supported efforts that led to the adoption of a presidential elections peace pact for Ghana. Can you share some of the key activities carried out by the Peace Council's work to prevent elections-related hate speech and violence during the general elections of December 2020?
All right, so thank you so much, Madam Chair. Very happy to see you. I think it's the first time that we are meeting. In Uganda, I'm not sure I met with you. The Peace Council was set up in response to protracted and violent conflicts in some parts of Ghana, particularly the northern parts of Ghana. And that was somewhere in 2002, when the overlord of a prominent traditional area was murdered, together with some 40 others. So the mandate of the Peace Council, as indicated in the Act, Establishing Act, Act 818, is to facilitate and develop the mechanisms to prevent, to manage, and to resolve conflicts. The end of it all, the mandate seeks to ensure sustainable peace in Ghana. So when the Peace Council was established as an administrative structure in 2006, elections were very close. 2008, there was an election. And we realized that one of the things that led to the unfortunate death of the king and others was hate language. People used the media as a platform to vent hate speech against opponents, either political opponents or religious opponents, particularly religious or political opponents. So it became an issue. And the Peace Council at the time, led by His Eminence Cardinal Pierre Texin, who is now in Italy, who is a Catholic, really mobilized people to ensure that the elections of 2008 went on without much difficulties. So in 2012, the Peace Council had received a legal backing by an act of parliament I just mentioned, Act 818. And that gave the Peace Council that legal authority, to mobilize. And one unique thing that distinguishes our Peace Council is the fact that out of the 13-member board, which constitutes the Peace Council, 8 of them are from religious groups in the country, religious institutions which have influence and who can, for example, bring their influence and credibility bear on their constituents. So in 2012, the Peace Council, together with its partners, decided to introduce the Peace Pact as one mechanism to preempt and prevent violent conflicts before the 2008 and 12 elections. So it was held in the second city of Ghana, Kumasi, where the Menchia Palace, a prominent chief, together with the Peace Council, rallied all the presidential candidates to sign on to the Peace Pact. It worked, and it became a precedent. So in 2016 elections, Ghana thought that this is a good lesson that we have to carry on, and we did that again. But before the 2016 elections, knowing very much how much hate speech, hate language, hate conduct can affect the outcome of the elections, the Peace Council decided to go to all the 275 constituencies in the country to press home the idea of non-violent uses in responding to our conflicts. So we did that, and we believe that it really mobilized Ghanaians against hate speech, and we had a successful elections in 2016. So in the last year's election, 2020 elections, the Peace Council once again went to all the 275 constituencies. Yeah, Ghana consists of 275 political constituencies. And the Peace Council touched base to all these areas to ensure that we drum home the message of nonviolence. And we succeeded. So the elections was held on the 7th of December. On the 4th of December last year, the Peace Council once again brought together, this time not all the candidates, but the two main contenders, the candidates of the National Democratic Congress, who is now the opposition leader, and the current president, Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, and they signed on to the Peace Pact. And we believe that it really, really prepared the ground for the outcome that we all saw. So we have been working through our partners. We targeted the youth as well. Particularly, we believe that they can be radicalized through hate words, hate speeches, etc. So we targeted them and it really, really worked for us. So I think for the opening, I think my time is up. The Peace Council, in the past 3 general elections in this country, has ensured that it reached out to the security agencies, the journalists, the religious leaders, the traditional leaders, the youth, and the political leaders. And it has really done a lot of difference in the elections of this country. And the records are there. We will not say that we contributed 100% to the election outcomes of the elections in the country, no. However, we believe strongly that the Peace Council contributed a lot to ensuring the outcomes of the past 3 elections that has lived the life of the Peace Council so far.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this extremely concrete example of, one, how hate speech can indeed provoke radicalization and violence. And second, a very concrete form of countering this by asking all of the relevant actors to sign up to this pact. This is extremely important. And you have also focused on, of course, you mentioned all sectors of society and of course the political opponents that need to sign. Yeah. But also that you have, like in previous panels, you have also stressed the importance of targeting the youth in this effort. This is extremely, extremely important. Thank you for this, and we will come back because I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions on this extremely interesting initiative. I go now to the another continent. I go to the Americas with Eduardo. Eduardo, we understand that there is these precautionary measures of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights that serve to protect individuals or groups of individuals who are at risk to prevent irreparable damage. Can you provide us examples from this practice in relation to preventing hate speech against individuals or group of individuals? Well, or provide good practices from national prevention efforts in the Americas to tackle hate speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Silvia, for the invitation. It's an honor for me to be part of this conversation. And I am glad that you had also the question about domestic practices. Let me start saying that some years ago, after being Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in the Organization of American States, the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights at the UN asked me to do some sort of assessment on how Article 20 of the ICCPR that include the problem of hate speech has been implemented in the Americas. And that was part of the process of what ends in what we call today the Rabat Principles. So we were experts coming from different parts of the globe doing an assessment on how countries in each of the regions are coping the problem of hate speech. Frankly, the findings in my old piece are, I think, that are still, important. And that can show you and the audience some practices coming from the region, particularly the Americas. We can say that in trying to cope with hate speech, and remember one thing, and one of the problematic things is that hate speech is speech in some way. And because it is speech, and we have strong provisions in preventing censorship, for example, sometimes it's very, very complicated to deal with this problem. Of course, under the Inter-American System on Human Rights, there is a strong standard explaining that hate speech is not covered by freedom of expression, but how we are going to determine what is hate speech and what speech is not hate speech and is only political opinions or something like that. Because this is a problem, because it could be used as a tool to censor minorities, to censor vulnerable groups, to censor opposition. And this is some things that we saw in our region. So I understand, I want to be clear, hate speech is not under, the protection of freedom of expression, but the problem is, what is hate speech? In the Americas, there are two specific models, if I may say, to cope with this problem. One is the punitive model, the other is a non-punitive model. The punitive model is related to, I would say, three different topics. One is including hate speech as a crime in criminal codes. The second is including hate speech in criminal legislation, but not specifically in criminal codes, for example, in anti-discrimination laws. The third one is including sanctions in administrative legislation. And this is important today because administrative sanctions or even regulations, particularly with the problem that we are facing today in global platform or in media platforms, running in the internet, is something very, very complicated, and it is an ongoing discussion in the region. The non-punitive model is a way that some countries are trying to cope with this problem, and particularly, and more specifically, is working on public policies that foster a non-criminal solution. And there I include what my colleague that spoke recently just said, target the youth and education. So there are some programs in some countries that are trying to promote, non-discrimination practices, try to explain the problem of hate speech and how hate speech can impact in the real world in ordinary people. And I will finish with something related to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and precautionary measures, that it was your first question, Silvia. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, I would say, I might start saying that the Inter-American System on Human Rights, both the court and the commission, have a system for preventing damages that are irreparable damages. At the level of the court, you have the provisional measures. At the level of the commission, you have precautionary measures. The name changed, the body changes, but the goal is exactly the same. Specifically in the case of hate speech, I would say that the Inter-American Commission specifically did more public statements or press releases, or include their concern, the concern of the commission in press releases or in specific reports, than doing precautionary measures. I remember, for example, in 2017, if I recall correctly, that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights did a very strong statement against hate speech And in the case of violent demonstrations in the US, particularly in Virginia, you can find this strong statement calling the government to do something to prevent hate speech practice, hatred, actions. And this is something that is under the concern of the Inter-American Commission, but at the same time, the concern is not using measures that under the title of hate speech can prevent legitimate speech, legitimate expression, and at the end of the day, censor vulnerable groups, minorities, or even political oppositions parties. And I will stop there, Silvia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eduardo. And thank you for bringing us to the beginning, I would say, because indeed yesterday we started by saying, well, what is hate speech? And the problems of, well, the lack of a globally recognized definition of hate speech and how to distinguish hate speech from what I would say legitimate speech, or and what is a threshold to take action against it. So thank you for this, and also thank you for reminding us of principles that are already there in this area, like the Rabat principles, but also the various models, the punitive model and the non-punitive model that you mentioned. I think this is extremely important, and maybe we can come back to this. And the non-punitive model, again, focusing on policies, education, and targeting also the youth. The youth, we have been speaking about this quite a bit in these 2 days on the discussion. And I think this also adds to what has been said by George, who also focused on the youth, as you recall. But he also gave us also a third model, I would say, which is to have some kind of pact for concrete circumstances, for instance, elections, where everybody, all those concerns, agree not to use hate speech in their campaigns, for instance. So I think all these are extremely important remarks. I would like to remind participants that they can ask questions through the chat. And now we will move to the next speaker, Vidit, that you have served as I said, a special rapporteur on many United Nations human rights bodies, as well as chaired various international commissions of inquiry. So, Vidit, based on your experience, what lessons can be drawn with respect to identifying and tackling hate speech to prevent the recurrence of gross violations of human rights? And maybe here you can add to these ideas on models to follow. So maybe you can share some examples of good practices from national prevention efforts in the Asia-Pacific region.
Thank you very much, Chair, and warm greetings to everyone from Bangkok. This is mid to late evening in Bangkok. I think the word context is very important, politically context, very, very important in terms of how to understand the political context around the hate speech. If we are faced, as we are faced in the Asia-Pacific region with many non-democratic countries, any laws, policies, and practices that constrain freedom of expression and freedom of association and assembly should be looked at with great care. In other words, we might be co-opted under the rubric of anti-hate speech when it's actually the government or the authorities trying to clamp down politically by invoking hate speech. And so that is a very important consideration. Be very careful when you're faced with undemocratic regimes, because they will use anything, including the invocation of hate speech, to clamp down on political dissident and opposition. And I'm afraid that's half of Asia that we have to deal with, in fact. So I'm very careful and circumspect about any laws and policies which claim to address hate speech in this region, unless they fulfill international standards. So let's bear in mind the international standards. There are international standards, and some have been referred to already. Number one, we have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, particularly Articles 19 and 20. Article 19 is about freedom of expression, It's about possible limitations, such as national security perhaps, but must fulfill principles of legality, proportionality, and necessity. And then we have Article 20, which is about incitement to hatred, which might lead to discrimination and or violence. That is the universal UN threshold for laws and policies. It must be a very high threshold, not just hate, but incitement. A, inciting B to hate, to do something nasty, C. It's a triangular relationship, whether it happens or not, but it's a triangular relationship of hate, leading possibly to discrimination and violence. Now, having said that, being very careful, we come to number 2, which is a point. We have different forms of hate speech, so let's not be too general. We have the universal standards, which through particularly the ICCPR Articles 19 and 20, advocate that we should have laws and policies against what we can claim to be illegal hate speech. In other words, incitement to hatred that might lead to discrimination and violence. The second level is perhaps derogatory or toxic speech, which is not quite incitement. And that is the one taken up particularly by social platforms, apps today, particularly Facebook and others in Asia and elsewhere, to address homophobia and others, which are not necessarily to the threshold of Articles 19 and 20, as cited earlier. So that is an area where third parties or private actors come into play, particularly the business sector, very importantly, also in Asia. And then finally, in terms of the hate speech, the type of ordinary dislike or slightly offensive speech that all of us get into sometimes in our lives, sadly, if we misunderstand or if we're not empathetic enough to others. In other words, you dislike me, which might be a sort of hate, but you're not going to be able to deal with that through law at the state level. You're going to deal with it through education, empathy, cross-cultural programs, interreligious programming between the young people, between religious leaders, and so on. So there are different strategies coming to play here. And I want to round off the first round by saying this. There are 3 entry points or 4 entry points coming into play in terms of actions, which we can then identify. Number 1, let's flip it around. How about a good civilian population that's understanding? So much of this is going to be linked with education and cross-cultural and interreligious, intercommunity programming among young people and others. In other words, back to SDG number 4, global citizenship education, more cross-cultural programming from a young age. And we have a lead here from SDG 4, Sustainable Development Goal 4, and many programs, much around you. I mean, I've been involved in community programs linking up Buddhist people with Islamic Muslim populations and so on. So I see this all the time. You don't have to look very far. Last weekend, I was at a funeral where the Christians cooperated with the Buddhists to organize the funeral. It's a very personal approach, but I thought I was congratulating the group for being very empathetic. And that's exactly how to prevent hate speech, actually, through a very personal experience. Flip it round. The second level, after the general population through good education, is possible national mechanisms, good courts, good national human rights commissions, and so on. And they all deal, if they're good courts, if they're good institutions, particularly national human rights commissions, they deal with minorities and indigenous peoples already. So let's invite them to do a bit more. I don't think they do enough yet on hate speech, but many of them do quite a lot on anti-bullying and anti-discrimination. And that's a starting point. I cite one, Malaysian Human Rights Commission, very brave to come out to advocate against violence in regard to LGBT groups. Very brave, even though the authorities are much less brave there. And it's only one step further to prevent hate speech against LGBTI people. So it's a starting point in terms of national human rights institution. The third level is your private actor, particularly your platforms and social apps. And this is very important because Facebook, Google, and others all have policies which go beyond the international standards to counter particularly the derogatory or pejorative types of situations, such as homophobia. And they can take down materials. The platforms such as Facebook take down millions, block millions per year, and they have an oversight committee that looks into this. But I think the jury's still out on this. Whether they take down enough is one question, which has to be proved. or whether they take down too much is also another question which has to be proved. And I heard from an oversight committee of Facebook recently that actually on some situations they take down too much. So let's prove it empirically, which means good data and good monitoring. And then the final level is the top level, it's the state, the fourth level. Well, I don't trust state action on some fronts if they're not democratic. In fact, in Asia, you have too many laws which claim to deal with hate speech, claim to deal with national interest, national security. So I'm a bit hesitant about all this. But let's say the preferred approach is to abide by ICCPR Articles 19 and 20. And I think the better examples come perhaps from the more democratic systems. Australia has an anti-racial discrimination law, as well as anti-sex discrimination law. Likewise, Human Rights Act in New Zealand. And there's a smart mix between civil liability and criminal liability. Anti-hate speech in terms of action does not have to be criminalized alone. It can be also civil action as well as administrative action, as well as social action in terms of counteraction. So let's look at these different possibilities. And when you come to the state level, be very careful. They really have to prove hard and fast that they need a law on the basis of international standards. If not, I don't really trust the laws and policies and practices at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for assisting us also in trying to understand, again, what is hate speech. And you mentioned the different levels, the level that goes indeed to incitement, or to the threshold of the Articles 19, 20 of the ICCPR. Then you go into the toxic speech, and then the ordinary dislike. So I guess we all go into some kind of hate speech in our daily life. And also thank you again for going into the levels of actions that you probably recommend. We noticed that you start with the general population and education, then you go into the national mechanisms, good court, good institutions. This is something very important to bring into the debate. And then, of course, the private actors, the companies, and whether we can trust them or whether they are the right ones to start taking down contents. And there is some discussion on this, on how do they do this, and whether this can be done actually. And fourth, and I can see that you're extremely reluctant when you go into state actors. Be careful, you've been very, very, very clear about this. And this is very interesting because in the other panel, in the European context, many were saying, well, we need state action. And here you are saying, well, important, it's the context, because you don't want actions that would actually would go against speech on the excuse that you want to counter hate speech. And I think Eduardo also mentioned this, that we need to be very, very careful on the punitive model, because you need to safeguard the freedom of expression. Now, we have some questions now that are coming from the audience that I have here, and that we go and into specific types of hate speech. There is a question here that it is for George, but maybe the three panelists can say something of this, because I think it's probably in all continents that we have observed a rise on hate speech and discrimination during the COVID pandemic. The question here for George was, how was this factor into the guidelines the Council is elaborating to facilitate the production of legal framework on hate speech and guide journalist standard and political behavior? This is one, but on the COVID, maybe in the other continents, maybe there is something that you can add on this. So, so maybe we can start with this question. And you are all welcome to step in. But George, it was specifically addressed to you, so maybe you can start.
All right, Sylvia, thanks once again. Ghana, did not suffer the pandemic in the way that others suffered. However, we took precautionary measures during particularly the last year's elections. The social distance, wherever we went, we ensured that we provided the materials to protect our people or our participants, from getting infected. So we did that, sanitizing and all that. I think it was a good opportunity to also raise the educational bar. We did that quite well, and we think that we largely succeeded. And but I don't know whether I can touch on some issues, or I should give room to others. We decided together with the Media Commission of Ghana to develop guidelines against hate speech. And next week, we are going to meet again on this same, with the support of the Danish Embassy here in Accra. We have realized that there are two main things that drive hate speech or hate language, as we know the term here: fear and mistrust. Fear of probably the political class, religious class, and mistrust that is so deeply seated here in Ghana. Mistrust of institutions. So people want to know what is happening. They don't trust the institutions, so they come up with so many things, sometimes very distasteful in their commentaries. And these are the two key things that is driving hate speech in the country. And how do we resolve them? We have, like I've said, we've decided to put together a framework to guide behavior, considering all the factors that Professor Vidit and my other colleague have all said. And we are trying also to standardize the guidelines in consonance with the ICCPR and other international documents, particularly the African Union protocols, ECOWAS protocols. So we are trying to do that. And we believe strongly that if we're able to increase participation, you are able to increase inclusiveness, you are able to expose cultures. Indeed, Ghana and the Peace Council is a critical example where we have the Christians and the Muslims and the African traditional religion believers all on the Peace Council board, taking decisions mainly by consensus. And we try to visit. For example, I am a Christian, but I go to mosque almost all the time. You see, it removes the fear factor. We are trying, last year, we did something very significant in Ghana. There was this malaise, vigilantism became an albatross ahead of the last elections, where political vigilantes or so-called supporters of political parties and actors would want to use violence as a method of achieving their goals. Violence on the media, using all kinds of violent words, hate words. So we have used mechanisms such as increasing dialogues, and we're able to succeed. We brought the two main political parties together, NDC, MPP, and we developed a roadmap, which is guiding behavior. We developed a code of conduct, which though is not binding in the law courts, but has a lot of moral persuasion, which worked in our opinion, because we didn't see the vigilantism thing coming up strongly in the last elections. So we have to deal with the issues of fear, with the issues of mistrust, particularly on our side of the globe, where institutions are less trusted, where politicians say one thing and do another. You see, they will use all kinds of tactics, including hate speech, in ensuring they bring their opponents down. So we have been doing that. We think that by and large, it is really working for us. And if we're able to get the framework also in place, and I strongly believe, particularly in Ghana here, in Africa, if you try to allow the state to move anything regarding hate speech, I'm sure they are going to muzzle speech. Free speech is going to be affected, and you would have people who cannot talk, who when they talk, anything can happen to them. And it has happened here in Ghana. I heard of the last somebody, a journalist, was killed, unfortunately, because somebody was said to have said something on television, which sparked somebody to do what he did. So I think it's very important we don't also allow the too much space for the state to lead the discussion, regarding developing kinds of frameworks for protecting speech.
Thank you for these additions. Thank you for these additions. And I do have some questions coming in. Well, of course, the one on COVID, if you want to add anything from the Americas on the Asia Pacific on this, but actually there are questions also on hate speech on a gender basis. And actually, there is a very specific question for Eduardo to know whether his institute has specific education programs that may aim at breaking the gender stereotypes. And then also from the Asia Pacific region, whether this is also, if you have any recommendations on these issues on gender identities and how to counter hate speech on that front. So I don't know who wants to step in. Maybe Eduardo, you want to step in?
Yes, Silvia, thank you. Let me say something about the COVID-19, question and in the Americas, and then I will move to this very important question on gender's perspective in our field or in this field. COVID-19 and hate speech, frankly, and I don't want to be misunderstood. I mean, hate speech is a problem in Latin America, and we need to work on that. I'm not saying that there is not a problem, but frankly, during the pandemic, I would say that the main concern was not hate speech, but misinformation or disinformation. Okay, not specifically hate speech. Actually, from throughout my office at the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights, we organized a meeting, a virtual meeting on hate speech and freedom of expression, because our concern and the main concern in the Americas is exactly what I was talking before, is the problem to use the argument of hate speech that again exists, but to use that argument to censor people. And our concern is how social media, how media platforms are censoring people under the concept of hate speech, that it is not a very clear concept, as you said. I am during our meeting, and our meeting is in our website, some peoples are, highlighting the Rabat principles as a way to have some sort of specific checklist to understand when we are going to consider some speech as a hate speech. So those are the main concerns in the region, but including during the pandemic. And talking about the activities of the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights, yes, we have the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights is the academic branch of the Inter-American System of Human Rights. So we have two pillars. One is education, the other is promotion. In terms of education, in all of our courses, including the current course that is the interdisciplinary course on human rights that is running this month, the Institute always include a gender's perspective in teaching, human rights. So that's a short answer about what the Institute is doing, but I invite people to see our website and see all of our work in the Institute. Thank you, Silvia.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Vidit, you want to?
Yes, 3 observations and 4 or 5 quick recommendations. Number 1, COVID has led to not only a medical lockdown, but also a political clampdown. Why? So many countries of this region and beyond use either state of emergency law or very draconian medical laws to clamp down. So what you witness is less speech. That is the reality. And hate speech arises under that because people are frustrated, particularly against the authorities, and then they are clamped down. So be very careful there in terms of the paradoxes and lessons learned from COVID, but it's also an opportunity. COVID teaches us that the totality of human rights, civil, political, economic, social, cultural, go together. We need freedom of speech as well as right to healthcare and the possibility of commenting on the quality of the healthcare, which is freedom of speech. Secondly, where we have laws, policies on hate speech, such as in Australia or in New Zealand, where the laws are not so bad, they tend to be on race and sex, the traditional sex of male, female, binary. But today we want to have broader laws that cover the possibility of preventing hate speech in regard to other forms of protected characteristics, such as sexual orientation, gender identity, sex characteristics, and so on. So yes, we want a broader coverage, but on the basis of international standards, not just race and not just sex the old way, but gender in a broader sense, gender identity, etc., as well as nationality issues in terms of migrant workers and non-nationals, and maybe some political differences as well in terms of even ideologies, in terms of respect or openness there. So I'd like that broadening if possible, even among those that are performing well. But my mistrust is still very much there vis-a-vis undemocratic systems that prevail in half the region. And please don't compare the two regions. You can't be a member of the European Union unless you prove that you're democratic. But in Asia, half of Asia is not democratic. Doesn't mean that it's bad on every front, but it's still a fact that we have to bear in mind that they're not too nice on freedom of expression on many fronts. And thirdly, as an observation, in terms of monitoring, we need to monitor the hate speech in different languages. Now, what's happening with the private sector, the apps today in terms of their oversight and their monitoring is that they don't monitor enough the multilingual situation. It's mainly in English. So we need greater transparency in terms of monitoring vis-a-vis hate speech in multilingualism and multimodal ways of communication. So those are three observations. And finally, quick recommendations. Number one, if a state is to have a law and policy against hate speech, it must comply with ICCPR and the Convention Against Racial Discrimination, particularly Article 4. So it's Articles 19 and 20 of ICCPR and Article 4 of Convention Against Racial Discrimination. Otherwise, I don't trust the laws. Sorry. Number two, for the private sector, we have guidance now, whether it be platforms or other private sector. We have the human rights general principles, guiding principles on business and human rights, which call for due diligence. So let's call upon all private firms, etc., to carry out due diligence in regard to preventing hate speech as well as attenuation. Together with self-regulation, which open to transparent monitoring, as well as maybe technical solutions, but on the basis of openness and oversight that can be linked with the international standards ultimately, even though they can cover issues which are broader than the international standards. For example, homophobia in general. Thirdly, national institutions, human rights commissions. GAMAC, can you get hold of them, please, and work with them? They have a gunnery, they have a caucus of national human rights institutions. Work with them, push them to put the hate speech on the agenda, and they don't do it yet, even though they're dealing with minorities and peoples. And then fourthly, at the regional level, we have some regional institutions, such as ASEAN. ASEAN has a digital master plan 2025, which talks about connectivity, overcoming the impact of COVID, broadband access, and so on. Let's encourage these institutions at the regional level with master plans on digitalization to incorporate human rights. They don't do so enough yet. So human rights sensitive master plans. And then finally, the people at large, let's be guided by SDG 4 global citizenship education, broad-mindedness, liberal education, inter-community, inter-religious programs, of which there are many, including the ones surrounding us all the time. You don't have to look very far. But what I want also is good counter speech. Let's enable people to group up to counter the bad speech. We haven't done that enough. So that would call for real mobilization.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very good way of ending our panel. We need to start closing. We ran out of time. This has been a really fascinating discussion where we have gone back very much to the basics. What are we talking about? How to counter this? Go back to the importance of international law and international standards for whatever action we want to take. And also the importance of education and also the importance of good institutions, self-regulation, and national institutions. So we have no more time, but if you have one more thing that you would like to say in 1 second or 2 seconds, I don't know, Eduardo or George, would you like to add something?
Yeah, maybe it's a repetition of what I just said. I mean, this is a problem. We need to deal with this problem for the benefit of democracy and for the benefit of the people, but we need to be aware not to create mechanisms that could be used as tool for censorship.
Thank you. You said it, but I think it is extremely important to highlight it as a main takeaway of this. We have to be very careful that when we counter hate speech, we don't go into a paradox that we provoke censorship. George, you have 1 more second if you want to add or highlight something that you think it is extremely important.
Sylvia, I think tolerance. Let us do what we can as global citizens to increase tolerance in our communities. I think that is key. If we're able to reach out more to people of different opinions, tolerate them, I think that we will have very little work to do in terms of hate speech and language. Let's increase tolerance. It should be part of everyday life, everywhere. Thanks.
Thank you. Tolerance. This is extremely important way, and it joins Avitit in the need to create counter narratives. So tolerance would be one. Vitit, you have 1 second only to say something if you want.
Inclusivity and empathy, please.
Okay.
No exclusion, no discrimination, no violence, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this wonderful panel. Thank you very much to all participants for their wonderful questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. And indeed, it was very interesting to see the difference between the discussion in the European context and the discussion in the international context. So thank you, everybody, for attending our 2 panel discussions. And of course, for those of you who attended the workshops earlier in the day, well, there are now 5 workshops for you to attend for the rest of the day. And you can see here, they've come up there. There's one on addressing hate speech and preventing genocide. Is education the answer? We've heard a lot about education. One from, of course, Taufik Jelassi, the Assistant Director General of UNESCO yesterday. He is responsible for communication and information. And of course, education is one of the key tools. Then there's another workshop coming up on ethnic and religious minorities in Europe, challenges and good practices in addressing hate speech and discrimination. Another workshop on good practices on the rights for all in addressing hate speech. And of course, interreligious dialogue and prevention of hate speech is another workshop, and vectors of hate speech and incitement, atrocity prevention and social media. We've been hearing a lot about social media and what rights and responsibilities should these social media companies have in countering hate speech. So I really encourage you to join one of those workshops now. Tomorrow, we have another panel discussion, and it's going to be very interactive. Sylvia is going to be moderating that one again. You can see that the title is Shaping Atrocity Prevention from the Ground Up. And we really need you to participate. You can see that there's going to be breakout sessions with regional initiatives. So do join us tomorrow. But for now, that's all from me and Sylvia.